You have to go back to the Gilded Age, the age of the robber barons, to find a period where there were comparable threats to American democracy. None of us is quite old enough to remember the days of the robber barons. And you know, as I've spent some time here at the convention, I've been inspired by so many of you, the passion that you bring here to these conferences, and the single-minded devotion that I pick up on for so many of you, and whatever dimension of the plagues that are warping our democracy that impassion you, that single-minded devotion is impressive. But I do have to offer this warning. Those who are seeking to dismantle democracy are not single-minded. And we have to be every bit as ambitious and every bit as holistic in defending democracy and seeking to protect democracy as they are in seeking to dismantle it.
No more silos.
And you know, we can't afford to reside in silos. We can't afford to compete with each other and consider our dimension of the democracy problem more important than somebody else's dimension. And there are people who would say that the first problem, and perhaps the only problem, is making sure that votes are counted and counted accurately and fairly. And I am impressed by the devotion to that cause that I experience here at this conference. But there will be others, and Larry Lessig, the Harvard University professor, just wrote that wonderful book, Republic Lost, and he said money in politics is the first problem. But you know, we can't afford to compete with each other, because those who are seeking to do harm, to do violence to democracy, have been incredibly holistic in the way they approach this. Yes, they are after vote counting. There's no question about that. And there is nothing more fundamental to democracy than the idea of one person, one vote. And there's no threat greater than the threat to that fundamental principle of one person, one vote. And to make sure that that principle is safe, we have to make sure that people can trust that one person has cast one vote and that it's been counted accurately. So yes, it does start there. That is a fundamental starting place. But of course, they haven't stopped there. They're just as interested in voter suppression. And they are just as active in attacking voting rights. And you know, it was decided in America that the poll tax was not only illegal but immoral. Well, Wisconsin, as many states, has passed a voter ID law. And those people who lack the proper photo identification, if they don't have the ID, they have to have a birth certificate in order to get the photo identification. If they don't have a birth certificate, depending on where you live, it's somewhere between $8 and say $30 to get a copy of your birth certificate. And if you're a woman and you no longer have your maiden name, you may need a copy of your marriage license to get the birth certificate to get the photo ID. The marriage license is going to be anywhere from $8 to say $20. You know, the poll tax that was outlawed during the civil rights era in today's dollar, was worth $10.64. Now, how is what is happening today different than that poll taxation? But you know, they aren't stopping with assaulting voting rights, because they also are seeking to rig elections through gerrymandered districts. A fundamental principle of democracy has to be that voters choose their representatives, not the other way around. And in state after state, it's the other way around. Representatives are handpicking their voters and creating districts that make it pretty much a foregone conclusion which party is going to control that seat. Now, if you have a secure vote and a secret vote, and you've jumped over the hurdles to exercise your voting rights, what condition is our democracy in if you have no meaningful choices on the ballot because of that gerrymandering? And they haven't stopped there. Of course, they are also after rigging elections through money in politics. Now again, as I said, it has been decided in this country that poll taxation is illegal and indeed immoral. But what is the money in politics game but a candidacy tax? Now, poll taxation is wrong, but candidacy taxation is okay? Because who in this room can afford to run for public office, for any major public office? Is that not another hurdle that has been erected to determine who can participate in our democracy and who cannot?
Yeah.
We have to care about that, and we have to push back against that assault as well. And then, of course, there are the assaults on the media. Not only media ownership, and you all, the first thing that springs to mind, of course, is Fox News. But there are so many others, the Franklin Center and all of these outfits that are springing up around state capitals that are operated by the Franklin Center. Don't get as much attention as Fox News, but they are every bit as sinister. And it's not only media ownership, but it's the media's addiction to money in politics. And their unwillingness to really inform us about what's going on in election campaigns or in our government. You have to pay for that airtime. You have to pay for your message to be disseminated to the masses because of that addiction. That is a fundamental threat to our democracy. And then, of course, when all of these policies are put in place, they've then systematically gone about the business of stacking courts to make sure that those laws are upheld as constitutional. Judicial reform has to be fundamental to our pursuit of a renewed and invigorated and healthy democracy in America. So we have to be every bit as ambitious and every bit as holistic as the enemies of democracy if we are to be friends of democracy. We can't afford to reside in those silos and decide that there's only one dimension to this problem. We are in the fight of our lives. There's no doubt about that. But being from Wisconsin, I can offer, as in closing, these words of assurance that we can take comfort in Wisconsin, but you all can relate to regardless of where you're from. Because we know, based on our own history here, that we don't face anything that hasn't been faced before and defeated. You go back to the Gilded Age, the age of the robber barons. There's a tourist trap in Wisconsin called Wisconsin Dells. You find some of the biggest water parks anywhere in America in Wisconsin Dells. Buried deep below all those tourist destinations is the story of our salvation. Because back in the 1800s, when Wisconsin Dells was known as Kilburn City, it was named for a man named Byron Kilbourne, a railroad baron, who built a railroad spanning our state from Milwaukee to La Crosse to the Mississippi River, and he crossed the Wisconsin River at what is now Wisconsin Dells. They named the town for him. That railroad was built on bribes. That railroad was built on political extortion. Because in Wisconsin at the time, bribing public officials was perfectly legal. And bribe public officials, Byron Kilbourne did. He went to the state capitol and made over $275,000 worth of bribes to members of our state assembly to pass a land grant bill that gave him free land from Milwaukee to La Crosse. And they passed his bill. And he went back to the state senate. He made $150,000 or so in additional bribes to get the Senate to pass his bill, and they did. And he went to the governor, Coles Bashford, and gave him $50,000 to sign the bill into law, and he did. And they gave him free land that they seized from the people of Wisconsin. He built his railroad, and they named Wisconsin Dells for him. And if you drive in downtown Milwaukee to this day, you'll drive on Kilburn Avenue, named for Byron Kilbourne. I tell that story not only because of the conditions it depicts, but because of the reaction it provoked. Legislators at the time who took all those bribes came to be known as the 40 Thieves. And in the next election, Wisconsin voters turned out of office every single one of the 40 Thieves. And Coles Bashford lost his next election by 118 votes to Alexander Randall, for whom Camp Randall Stadium is named, where the Badgers play their football. And that started a revolution in Wisconsin that bred the progressive movement and the rise to power of Fighting Bob La Follette. And in 1897, bribing public officials was outlawed. In 1897, and this state became a state in 1848. That means for the first half century of statehood, it was perfectly legal to bribe public officials. In 1897, that crooked practice ended. In 1905, corporate campaign contributions and corporate election spending were prohibited, and that led to perhaps the greatest legislative session in American history. the 1911 session of the legislature. Workers' compensation was created. Child labor laws were enacted. Railroad regulation and railroad reform was passed. Insurance reform, the first state life insurance program anywhere in America, created right here in Wisconsin. A Corrupt Practices Act that built on the political protections. The first vocational, technical, and adult education system anywhere in America. We're in one of those today. The first one ever built in America was created by the 1911 legislature. They did that then because they were free to do that. They were free to lead. They were liberated from the legal bribery. We have come full circle. We're back in the conditions that those people faced. But what they taught us is that you can rise up against that kind of corruption and defeat it. We don't face anything today that hasn't been faced here before in Wisconsin. Wisconsin people know as well as anyone that we can defeat these forces, and we will, but we'll only do that if we are every bit as ambitious and every bit as holistic as the enemies that we seek to defeat. Thank you.